The photograph looks unreal at first glance, like some kind of clumsy montage. A bomber is flying with its tail almost torn completely away, hanging by what seem to be a few twisted beams, scraps of aluminum, and dangling wires. You can see daylight where solid metal should be. Every engineer who first looked at that image said the same thing. This aircraft should not be in the air. And yet, inside that shattered machine, 10 men were still alive, defying gravity, logic, and the expectation of violent death. This is the story of B-17 number 41-24406, the All-American, the flying fortress that refused to fall from the sky. Stay with it to the end, because what kept this wreck of an airplane flying was not just rivets and design. It was stubborn human will, calm under terror, and something that even enemy pilots could only describe as a miracle. To understand why the All-American story became legendary, you have to understand the machine itself. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't just another bomber. It was the backbone of the United States Army Air Force's strategic bombing campaign in World War II. With 4 roaring Wright Cyclone engines strapped under its wings, the B-17 could haul more than 2 tons of bombs deep into enemy territory. 13 50-caliber machine guns bristled from nose, tail, top, belly, and sides, turning it into a flying porcupine of steel and fire. Pilots loved the B-17 not just because it could hit hard, but because it could take punishment that would rip lesser aircraft apart. Stories spread through squadrons of fortresses limping home on 3 engines, then on 2. Crews told of aircraft with holes big enough to crawl through in their wings, of planes dripping fuel and oil, landing with systems shredded and yet somehow still in one piece. Empty, a B-17 weighed more than 15 tons. Fully loaded with fuel, bombs, and crew, it could push 30 tons. Its wings stretched over 30 meters from tip to tip. And inside that metal giant, 10 men each held responsibilities that could not be dropped for even a second. The pilot and co-pilot sat up front, the ones who had to coax that huge machine into the air, thread it through flak and fighters, and somehow bring it back. A navigator hunched over charts, compasses, and instruments, quietly steering the bomber across hundreds of kilometers of hostile sky. A bombardier lay in the glass nose, peering through the top-secret Norden bomb site, calculating the exact moment to release the payload. A flight engineer watched the aircraft's vital signs, oil pressures, fuel levels, hydraulic systems, ready to improvise repairs in midair if anything failed. A radio operator maintained the fragile thread of communication back to base and across the formation, sending and receiving messages that could mean survival or disaster. And then there were the gunners, posted at every vulnerable angle: nose, top, tail, belly turret, and waist positions, ready to spit fire at enemy fighters approaching from any direction. Each man depended on the others absolutely. Any mistake, any lapse in discipline or courage could mean the death of all 10. The All-American was one of these flying fortresses, built at Boeing's plant in Seattle and delivered to the 97th Bombardment Group, 414th Squadron, operating out of North Africa. It arrived at the airfield near Biskra, Algeria, around Christmas 1942. The plane was new, its aluminum skin still relatively fresh, its engines barely broken in, but war ages men and machines quickly. Before long, the All-American had flown several combat missions against Axis targets in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Each time it came back, the crew's confidence grew, not arrogance, but a hard trust, forged in flak and tracer fire. They began to believe that this particular aircraft had something special, that it would bring them home no matter how bad things got. None of them imagined how brutally that belief would be tested. In command of the All-American was Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg Jr., a young pilot in his 20s who had been dreaming of flying since he was a boy. When war broke out, he had signed up without hesitation. Bragg wasn't a man of drama. He was known for his calm, almost icy composure under pressure. When things went wrong in the air, he didn't shout or freeze. He thought. He chose. That ability to remain steady when everything around him screamed chaos quickly earned him a crew of his own. At his side sat his co-pilot, Lieutenant Godfrey "Bill" Angel Jr., another competent flyer with a different energy. Angel was the talker, the joker, the one who kept the crew's spirits up with stories and humor. But when his hands wrapped around the controls, the jokes disappeared. He was focused, disciplined, a perfect complement to Bragg's cool authority. Navigation fell to Harry C. Nussel, the man whose figures and charts made the difference between returning to a friendly runway and running out of fuel over endless desert. Hours of flight meant hours of constant corrections, recalculations, and adjustments. There was no GPS, no digital safety net, only skill and concentration. Up in the nose, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge was in charge of what the mission was really about, putting explosives precisely where they would hurt the enemy most. The Norden bomb sight he used was one of the most advanced devices of the war, capable of astonishing accuracy when operated by expert hands. Burbridge was one of those experts. Behind the cockpit, flight engineer Joe C. James knew the B-17 almost like a doctor knows his patient. He listened to the engines, watched every gauge, and read every vibration. If something failed, he had seconds to understand and, if possible, fix it with tools, tape, or pure ingenuity. Radio operator Paul A. Galloway was the invisible voice of the aircraft, quietly maintaining contact with base and formation, weighing the constant risk that any transmission could lead enemy ears straight to them. And then there were the gunners. Elton Cond crouched in the cramped ball turret under the belly, Michael Zuck and others at the waist guns, and in the most vulnerable, lonely position of all, tail gunner Sam T. Sarpelis, sealed into the extreme rear of the plane, watching the most common direction of enemy attack. Alone back there, he often saw death coming before anyone else did. By February 1, 1943, this crew had flown together enough to move almost as one organism. That morning dawned clear over Biskra. The sky was bright. Visibility excellent. Perfect weather for bombing, and perfect weather for enemy fighters to see them coming. The target that day was critical. The German-held port facilities of Tunis and Bizerte in Tunisia. Through these ports flowed the lifeblood of the Axis forces in North Africa. Supplies, vehicles, fuel, and reinforcements that sustained Rommel's troops. Hitting them hard could choke the enemy's ability to fight. The mission briefing was direct. The formation would fly in tight, overlapping fields of defensive fire, follow a specific approach route, drop their bombs, and then get out, expecting heavy flak and aggressive Luftwaffe resistance. Back at the All-American, the crew moved through their pre-flight ritual with methodical care. Each system was checked and rechecked. Bomb racks were loaded with precision. Fuses double verified. The machine guns were inspected, cleaned, charged with belts of heavy .50 caliber rounds. Oxygen systems, radios, controls, everything had to work. Thousands of small details stood between them and catastrophe. When the time came, the 4 engines of the All-American roared to life, one after the other, the sound shaking the ground and the chests of men standing nearby. That thunder meant power, meant a chance to go out and come back. Lined up with other bombers, the All-American rolled down the runway, accelerating, straining, then lifting into the thin, cold air. The formation climbed toward more than 5,000 meters, where the air was harsh, but the range of many anti-aircraft weapons was reduced. From that height, the North African desert spread out beneath them like a tan ocean. Sand, rock, occasional roads, scattered oases and villages that flashed past in miniature. Inside the bomber, the temperature plummeted. Breath froze in masks, and bare metal burned with cold at the touch. As the formation approached Tunis, the tension rose palpably in every heart. Gunners scanned the skies in all directions, searching for the telltale glint or shape of enemy fighters. The navigator confirmed their path. The city and port loomed ahead. Then the first black puffs of flak appeared in the sky ahead, at first distant, then swelling closer, until explosions were blooming around the formation in ugly black flowers. The air filled with splinters of hot steel ripping past at incredible speed. Some struck metal with sharp, vicious clangs. The smell of burned powder and smoke seeped even into the sealed oxygen masks. The formation held course, steady and unwavering, because any abrupt maneuver would scatter the bombers and weaken their mutual defense. Down in the nose, Burbridge leaned over the bomb site. His world narrowed to crosshairs, drift, speed, and wind. The Norden was tied into the aircraft's autopilot. In these final critical moments, before bomb release, the bombardier effectively flew the plane, making tiny corrections to keep it exactly on course. The call came through the intercom. Bomb bay doors open. Below, the great doors swung down, letting icy wind roar through the internal structure. The plane shuddered differently now, its aerodynamics altered. Burbridge counted down silently in his mind, corrections and calculations dancing under his fingers. And then, bombs away. More than 2 tons of explosives dropped free. The aircraft lifting slightly in relieved weight. The mission's primary purpose had been fulfilled. Now came the part that often killed crews: getting out. The formation began its turn away from the target area, but the crew knew what was coming. The Luftwaffe had learned that bombers, lighter and more disordered after dropping their loads, were vulnerable. They waited until this moment to strike in force. And they did. Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters plunged into the bomber stream, their cannons spitting shells and tracers that sliced through the sky like streaks of white-hot lightning. The whole world outside the bomber seemed to erupt in movement and fire. Inside the All-American, gunners swung into action instantly. The rattle and thunder of 13 machine guns firing at once filled the fuselage, casings clattering across the floor. Tracers arced out toward the diving fighters. One Messerschmitt roared past close enough for the crew to see its markings and even a flash of the pilot's helmet. Concentrated fire from the top and side guns stitched through its engine and fuselage. Smoke poured from the fighter's nose as it broke away, mortally wounded, disappearing into the chaos. But another attacker was already pressing in. This one came from the front, head-on. It was a newer, deadly tactic the Luftwaffe had adopted. The B-17's nose was less heavily defended, and a frontal attack gave bomber crews almost no time to react. The German pilot aimed his machine squarely at the All-American, fire already spraying from his guns. The nose of the bomber exploded in shards of plexiglass and metal as bullets tore through. At the last possible moment, he should have veered away, flashing past the bomber in a near miss. But he didn't. For a split second, everything seemed to slow. Bragg pulled on the controls, trying to pull the bomber out of harm's way, but it was too late. The enemy fighter slammed into the All-American's rear fuselage in a violent collision that shook the aircraft to its core. The shriek of metal being torn apart echoed like the world itself splitting. The Messerschmitt's wing sliced diagonally through the rear of the B-17, just behind the waist gun positions. What followed almost cut the All-American in two. The tail section was ripped open, as if someone had peeled back the fuselage with a giant can opener. An enormous gash yawned open, exposing the interior to the brutal high-altitude wind. The left horizontal stabilizer tore completely away and vanished into the sky. The vertical fin was mangled, twisted like crumpled paper. Control cables were severed, electrical lines snapped, hydraulic and oxygen systems at the rear were shredded in an instant. The tail section did not fall away entirely. Instead, it hung on by a terrifyingly small amount of structure. Two thin longerons and a narrow strip of aluminum skin not much wider than a man's hand. The German fighter disintegrated in the impact, fragments embedding themselves in the torn rear of the bomber. The enemy pilot, likely already dead or unconscious from earlier hits, had no chance. Inside the All-American, chaos exploded for a few seconds. A torrent of wind howled through the gigantic wound, ripping at maps, paper, loose gear. Anything not firmly strapped down was sucked out into the sky. The temperature plunged even further. Men clung to whatever they could. In the cockpit, Bragg grabbed the controls and felt nothing. They were slack, unresponsive, as if cut loose from the aircraft. The cables that connected his hands to the rudder and elevators had been shredded by the collision. The bomber should, by every law of aerodynamics, have pitched, rolled, and tumbled into a deadly spin. But it didn't. Against all expectation, the All-American did not immediately break apart or dive. It stayed roughly level, trembling and shuddering violently, but still flying. In the tail, Sam Sarpalis found himself in a nightmare, within a nightmare. The section he occupied was almost entirely separated from the rest of the airplane. Through newly opened cracks, he could see the sky rushing by where solid metal had been minutes before. The tail flexed and swayed with every gust. It looked and felt as if one wrong movement could send it snapping away into nothingness. Yet, his intercom still worked. "Tail to pilot," he called, his voice steadier than anyone had a right to expect in that moment. "I'm still here, but you need to see this from outside. It's bad. Very bad," Bragg answered, fighting to keep his own voice calm. "Roger. Tail. Hold on. We're going to get us all out of here." He said it as if it were a simple decision. How exactly? He did not yet know. The first seconds after the impact were critical. Bragg and Angel quickly tested what was left of the aircraft's control. The mechanical linkage to the tail surfaces was gone. Two engines on the right side were either heavily damaged or completely out. Oil streamed from a third. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. Oxygen to part of the crew was cut off. By any reasonable measure, this aircraft was finished. But there was one unexpected advantage. The electrical autopilot system, connected to the Norden bomb site, was still partially functional. Unlike the main control cables, this system used electrical signals and servo motors to move the tail surfaces. Angel saw the faint possibility in this. "We might still have something," he said. "If the autopilot servos are responding, we can try to fly her with that." They began to experiment, cautiously. Small inputs through the autopilot produced small changes in pitch and yaw. It was sluggish, imprecise, nothing like the direct control they were used to. But it was something. Through this fragile, jury-rigged connection, they could nudge the aircraft up or down, gently to one side or the other. It was the only reason they had a chance. Meanwhile, flight engineer Joe James battled another enemy: failing power. Two dead engines meant they were losing thrust. One remaining engine was leaking oil badly and could seize at any moment. With the drag caused by that gaping hole and mangled tail, the All-American was bleeding speed and altitude. James adjusted throttle and mixture, watching temperatures and pressures like a hawk, trying to squeeze every remaining ounce of performance from the surviving engines without driving them into failure. In the waist section, the gunners stared in stunned disbelief at the rear of their own plane. Through the torn fuselage, they could see Sarpalus in the tail, almost as if he were sitting in a separate aircraft, bouncing and flexing behind them, hanging on by a strip of metal and a prayer. The situation was desperate enough. Then it got worse. Two more enemy fighters spotted the crippled bomber lagging behind the main formation. To German pilots, a straggling bomber was an opportunity. Slower, alone, easier to bring down. They approached cautiously at first, circling, assessing. But the All-American wasn't done fighting. Its gunners tracked the attackers, waiting. When the Messerschmitts finally committed to their runs, the response was immediate and furious. 50 caliber rounds streamed out from the damaged bomber in thick, lethal arcs. The German pilots quickly realized that despite its shredded tail, this flying fortress still had teeth. After several attack passes met with accurate, determined fire, they decided the crippled aircraft was not worth the risk and broke off, searching for softer prey. Now the All-American had a single objective: get back to Biskra without tearing itself apart. With control limited to the sluggish autopilot servos, every maneuver became a dangerous gamble. They needed to turn back toward Algeria, but any sharp bank could exert lateral forces that might snap the tail free. Bragg chose the only option that made sense, the gentlest, longest turn possible. Very slowly, using the autopilot, they eased the bomber into a shallow bank. It took nearly 110 kilometers of sky to complete a 180-degree turn, an enormous, agonizingly gradual arc, the plane tilting just a few degrees off level. Every minute, men waited, scarcely breathing, expecting to feel the final shudder that would mean the tail was gone and the dive had begun. It didn't come. The nose finally swung back toward the south, toward the desert, and toward home. They were alone now. The rest of the formation long vanished ahead. The All-American thudded forward at reduced speed, losing altitude at about 30 meters per minute. James juggled engine power as if he were balancing on a knife's edge, terrified that pushing too hard would cause an overheat and failure, but also knowing that losing more thrust meant falling. In the shattered tail, Sarpalus stayed where he was. There was talk of trying to bring him forward, of having him crawl across the gap. But one look at the yawning hole and the screaming wind convinced them. If he tried, it might kill him. And his weight in the tail was actually helping keep the delicate balance of the aircraft. So he remained, isolated, staring out at empty sky through the gaps in the broken fuselage, clinging to his guns and his position. The waist gunners stood half-exposed to the open air, watching for any new threats, and at the same time acting, in a strange way, as ballast. The cold knifed through their flight suits, freezing their hands even through gloves. Time stretched. Every kilometer felt like 10. The broken bomber crawled on, crossing back over the invisible line between Axis-held territory and Allied-controlled skies. They were technically safer now, but one greater danger remained. They still had to land. As they approached friendlier skies, a new set of aircraft appeared, sleek P-51 Mustangs, American fighters on patrol. Spotting the wounded B-17, they moved in closer. The closer they came, the more stunned they were. One pilot eased up beside the All-American, cockpit nearly window to window with the bomber. When he saw the tail hanging by that narrow connection, his expression turned from curiosity to naked shock. Through the glass, he gestured emphatically, pointing downward toward the sea, miming parachutes and jumping. In his mind, there could only be one sane solution: abandon this death trap before it ripped itself apart. Bragg looked back, understood the message, and shook his head firmly. They didn't have enough parachutes. Some had been used and cut away earlier in the flight to try to stabilize parts of the damaged fuselage. Even if they had enough, bailing out over the desert with wounded engines and uncertain fuel would be another roll of the dice, and one he wasn't willing to take while the aircraft still showed any sign of staying in the air. This machine had carried them this far. He was determined to see if it could take them the rest of the way. The Mustang pilot nodded slowly, recognizing the resolve. He radioed ahead. The All-American was coming in. Clear the runway. Prepare for the impossible. The airfield at Biskra readied itself. The control tower ordered all other aircraft out of the way. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the sides of the runway, engines idling, crews tense and silent. Mechanics, officers, and other airmen gathered at the edges of the field, shielding their eyes against the sun, waiting. They had heard rumors over the radio about a shredded bomber trying to make it back, but few really believed that anything that badly damaged could actually arrive overhead. In the cockpit, Bragg and Angel went over their plan one last time. They would not attempt a complicated traffic pattern or series of turns. With their limited control, they would line up with the runway as far out as they could, then descend steadily, avoiding sudden changes in attitude. Speed was a cruel dilemma. If they came in too slow, the bomber might stall and drop, snapping the tail off. If they came in too fast, the landing impact would be brutal, likely tearing the aircraft apart on the ground. Bragg chose a slightly higher speed than normal, betting that controllability and a stable approach were worth the risk of a harder touchdown. He eased the bomber toward the field. Inside, Nussel, whose navigation work was essentially done, helped check emergency procedures and briefed the crew on what to do the moment they stopped, or if they didn't. Burbridge and the gunners made sure everything loose was tied down or wedged somewhere safe. In an impact, a toolbox could become a lethal missile. In the tail, Sarpalus braced himself, strapped in as securely as the mangled structure allowed. "I'm ready," he reported calmly. "Do what you have to do." The runway grew larger through the cockpit windows. Ground crews held their breath. The All-American crossed the edge of the field. The main wheels met Earth in a spray of sand and dust. The bomber bounced, then settled, skidding forward. Bragg fought to keep the nose up, straining to delay the moment when the tail would have to come down. Gravity finally won. The damaged rear slammed toward the ground. Metal shrieked as it scraped along the runway. Sparks flew in bright bursts. The tail whipped and flexed like a wounded animal. But incredibly, it did not tear free. The bomber slid, decelerating, throwing up a long trail of dust. Meters dwindled, then became centimeters. At last, the B-17 shuddered to a grinding halt. For a moment, there was only silence. No one moved. Then Bragg's voice broke through the intercom. "Everyone out! Now!" Engines were shut down. The roar that had filled their world faded, replaced by the crackle of cooling metal and distant shouting from the ground. One by one, the crew scrambled out through hatches, some stumbling, legs numb from long hours at their posts. Men on the ground rushed forward, helping them down. Sarpalus, stiff and barely able to feel his legs after his ordeal in the tail, had to be supported, lifted out of the shattered rear section that had been his prison and lifeline. They formed a small group on the ground. All 10 of them, and someone counted quickly. 1, 2, 3, 10. All alive. No one killed. No one even seriously injured. Only then did most of them fully turn and really look at their aircraft. The sight left them and the ground crews speechless. The damage was worse than almost anyone had imagined. The rear fuselage was almost completely severed, attached to the front by only two thin structural beams and that narrow strip of aluminum. The left horizontal stabilizer was simply gone. The vertical fin was twisted and half destroyed. The skin of the plane was riddled with hundreds of bullet and shrapnel holes. The photos taken that day would soon circle the world. Engineers at Boeing stared at them in disbelief. More than one said openly, "This airplane should never have flown." There is no rational technical explanation for how it stayed together. And yet, there it sat, in one piece, with 10 living men standing beside it. The All-American was not quietly scrapped after that miracle landing, as many might assume. Instead, mechanics worked for weeks, replacing sections, rebuilding structure, straightening what could be straightened, and replacing what could not. The bomber returned to service, reassigned to the 301st Bombardment Group. It flew more missions, dropped more bombs, and later served as a transport and utility aircraft. It remained in use until near the end of the war, finally being dismantled for salvage in Italy in March 1945. For more than 2 years after that impossible day, the bomber that had once been held together by little more than courage and a sliver of metal continued to do its job. The men who had lived through that flight carried it with them for the rest of their lives. Kendrick Bragg completed his combat tour and eventually went home, staying in aviation as a civilian pilot and instructor. On his desk, he always kept a photograph of the All-American in its most broken state, a reminder that what looks like a hard limit is sometimes only an illusion. Godfrey Angel turned his experience into a career in aeronautical engineering, dedicating himself to designing safer, stronger aircraft structures and control systems. Sam Sarpelis, the tail gunner who had sat alone in that nearly detached tail, became a survival instructor for bomber crews. He didn't just teach procedures, he taught attitude. "If you panic," he told young airmen, "you're already dead. Stay calm, think, and you might live through what looks impossible." Joe James continued working on aircraft, eventually running his own maintenance shop. He never stopped praising the B-17. "That airplane saved us as much as we saved it," he would say. Boeing used the images and story of the All-American during and after the war to show the strength of its design. Engineers analyzed the failure and survival in minute detail. How had those few remaining structural members withstood the forces of flight? Part of the answer lay in robust design and quality materials. Part of it, they discovered, was the way the crew had unconsciously distributed weight and minimized sudden movements, keeping loads as smooth as possible. But no calculation could fully capture what had happened there. There is a point where engineering meets something harder to name. The story of the All-American spread through military newspapers, books, documentaries, and museums. Headlines called it "the cruelest cut" and celebrated the bomber that conquered death. People who saw the photos for the first time had the same reaction: disbelief, followed by awe. Over time, the tale grew into more than just a war anecdote. It became a symbol of resilience, of refusal to surrender when every reasonable voice says, "It's over." The old phrase, "coming in on a wing and a prayer," took on new meaning. The All-American had come home on pieces of wing and a great many prayers. In quiet museum halls today, visitors walk around restored B-17s, shiny, polished, spotless. It's easy to admire their size, their symmetry, their mechanical elegance, and forget that, in war, these planes were often mangled, burned, torn apart, and yet still asked to bring men home. The All-American's story reminds us that behind every machine are human hands and hearts. It reminds us that the real heroes aren't only those charging with rifles on the ground. They are the pilots who refuse to abandon a broken aircraft they might still save. The engineers sweating over gauges while engines threaten to die. The gunners who stay at their posts in a tale that might separate at any second. The navigators who, in the middle of chaos, quietly chart a path home. Most of all, the story of the All-American speaks to something universal. You don't have to be in a warplane to know what it feels like when life seems to break in half around you. When everything you relied on suddenly looks fragile. When the rational choice seems to be giving up. The men in that bomber had every excuse to surrender to fear. They could have bailed out and trusted chance. Instead, they trusted each other. They trusted their training. They decided together to attempt what everyone else would have called impossible. And in doing so, they turned a moment of near-certain death into one of the most astonishing survival stories of World War II. When you look at those grainy photographs now, a bomber with its tail hanging by scraps of metal, high above the desert, you might still find it hard to accept that it actually flew like that, let alone landed gently enough for all 10 men to walk away. But it did. It happened because 10 ordinary men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, refused to surrender. With skill, discipline, and a fierce determination to live, they transformed a broken machine into a symbol. The All-American became more than the serial number on its tail. It became a testament to what courage looks like when everything is falling apart, and to what human beings can do when they decide that, as long as there is even a strip of metal and a thread of hope, they are not done fighting.